The Illinois primary will soon be here, and it just might mean something this year. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. With me here today, Dave Dahl is back, reporter extraordinaire, WTAX Radio Springfield.
More than just ordinaire. Thank you, Bernie.
Absolutely. And Peter Hancock is here, also a wonderful guy, State House reporter for Capital News Illinois. Welcome back, Peter.
Thanks, Bernie.
Okay, so Super Tuesday is next week. There is the primary in South Carolina is happening this weekend, and Illinois is just a little more than 2 weeks away, the St. Patrick's Day primary that we have. And Paul Simon Public Policy Institute did the Simon poll recently. They took a poll February 10 to 17, and Bernie Sanders had a slight lead. I can quickly go over the numbers. It was 475 likely Democratic primary voters out of the 1,000 people they talked to statewide, had a polling firm do it. Sanders at 22, Mike Bloomberg at 17, Joe Biden at 14, Pete Buttigieg at 13, Amy Klobuchar at 8, Elizabeth Warren at 6. Of course, that came before some various events that made Bernie the front runner and before all the other candidates in one of the debates pounced on Bernie. So what does this all mean, Peter?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think what it indicates with Bernie Sanders on top, that's not terribly surprising if you look at the 2018 elections here in Illinois. The Democratic Party has moved, the bulk of it has moved over into that liberal progressive wing. Little surprised to see Mike Bloomberg up that high.
A lot of TV advertising, and there's a lot of people who don't pay as much attention as we do.
Yeah. And the liberal wing or the progressive wing seems to be consolidating around Sanders because you see Elizabeth Warren down there at the bottom of the heap. And in the middle, you have the moderates, including Biden, Amy Klobuchar. I was a little surprised about Klobuchar because she's, from Minnesota, a nearby state. Means she probably campaigns well in the Midwest, knows how to speak Midwestern. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it looks like the progressive wing is kind of coalescing, at least at this moment. 2 weeks can be an eternity in a presidential campaign.
And truly, these results were all taken before Elizabeth Warren came out very strong, taking on Mike Bloomberg, and again, the others all took on Bernie, and Joe Biden was having some positive endorsements.
And those televised debates are drawing big audiences.
One of them was 20 million people, and the next
people.
one was like 15. And so you've got to figure there are some people in Illinois that make up some of that national. Dave, anybody excited out there about the campaign for president?
Well, whenever I think about the primary, I think of how little there is to vote for in Illinois. There are few contested races, at least around here. The Sangamon County Board doesn't even have any primary-wise.
Yeah, well,
congressional races, quite little note. I mean, the biggest race seems to be, number of races in the Chicago area and statewide, which Republican will be taking on Dick Durbin.
Yeah, and there's 5 candidates for that. Now, none of them have great names. Mark Curran is one of them, former Lake County Sheriff. Tom Tarter is a doctor from Springfield. He's another one. There's Dr. Robert Marshall, and I don't know if I can click off everybody in the field, but you've got 5 names. It's a Democratic state right now, or it seems to be in statewide elections like that, and Durbin is unopposed in the Democratic primary, so we'll see.
At least as far as downstate goes, I mean, all the factors I mentioned could tamp down interest.
Yeah, well, again, it kind of depends where things are presidentially. So
yeah, we've got a long way to go before that.
Yeah, and on the Republican side, it kind of depends how clearly there's a Bill Weld is a former governor of Massachusetts who's a Republican who's running against President Trump still nationally, but he didn't file in Illinois. So there was one person who filed in Illinois who is a no-name candidate from another state, one of these folks that you don't even know how they ended up getting on and probably didn't file enough signatures but didn't get challenged off the ballot. Maybe they did. But it's a name nobody knows, and so President Trump is the clear winner there. So Republicans may show up to the primary for local races, but as Dave says, there's not that many races. But maybe it's a thing to show party strength. Speaking of people who love elections but may not be able to participate in any more statewide ones or even local ones in Illinois, a guy named Rod Blagojevich, our former governor who was recently let out of prison. He had his sentence commuted by President Trump. He served nearly 8 years of his 14-year sentence for various plots and plans, including trying to extort money from a children's hospital in Chicago, a campaign contribution, before he let state money go to that facility. Rod Blagojevich has been now gray-haired as opposed to black-haired after his years in prison. Has been going on various television stations and other places, including in front of his house, saying that he did nothing wrong, he was just playing politics, and he's now a Trumpocrat because he likes President Trump.
As we're speaking here, the news is broken that he's on Cameo. You could pay Rod Blagojevich to record a customized message.
Is that right? I hadn't heard that.
How
much does it cost?
Well, I want to say it's 60 or 70 or something like that. Now, does Dr. Kim have a birthday coming up?
Well, I think we just missed it. So
personalized greeting from the former governor.
Well, he has to get, if he doesn't get a job, he needs to do 20 hours of community service while he's on probation for a time. There was a hearing before the Attorney Registration Disciplinary Commission about, I think, ending his right to practice law in Illinois. He did not show up to that hearing, so it looks like he's probably not going to be in any courtrooms, at least as an advocate, shortly.
I did speak to the spokesman for that commission who said, in this kind of circumstance, there's not really much to contest.
Right, you're a convicted
if you're
felon.
Convicted of felony, and he was convicted of felonies, then you're no longer qualified to hold a law license. So there wasn't really anything to contest, and there wasn't really that much reason for him to show up.
Yeah,
we're
makes
just
sense.
waiting for the final order to come out now.
Yeah, and I guess Mayor Lightfoot of Chicago, who said we have so many other things to talk about besides Rod, let's just do that. I guess we're not listening exactly, but Mayor, we're going to move on now.
Well, it is part of Illinois history, though.
He is.
I mean, you can't.
We elected him twice.
And I don't know if he'll make his way down to Springfield, but because he seems to like to relive his glory days, maybe he will head this way, despite the fact he didn't like to stay in the mansion very much.
And drag Patty and the girls here, maybe for the fair.
That's right. When we won't, well, the problem at the fair this time, the kids will be grown, so we won't be bothering his baby as we once did when we were trying to ask him questions and he didn't want to answer them that year. But I can't say they would just be left alone on the fairgrounds and not have reporters bother him, which is what he seemed to always want then, because I guess if he showed up, we would probably bother him and say, how you feeling about being back governor? So anyway, let's move over to some other stuff going on at the State House. There were some sheriffs that came to the State House this week to complain about a situation where people who have served their prison time in Illinois and who are undocumented, not undocumented residents of Illinois from other countries, are now just being let out and not being referred through a facility in Kankakee to federal authorities to check their immigration status to see if they should be deported. This follows the Trust Act, which the legislature passed, and it was signed actually by Republican Governor Bruce Rauner, which says unless you have a warrant for someone's arrest, you cannot hold them just because of their immigration status. Dave, the sheriffs are upset about this?
They're mad about it, and a cynic would say, well, they just don't like immigrants because these individuals have served their time and they're being released like citizens, and the Pritzker administration doesn't want to cooperate with the feds on this. But now it turns out that their business of transporting and housing these folks after they've served their time, but housing them for ICE so they can be deported, is lucrative for sheriff's departments. And the super cynic might say...
Would that be you?
Me.
Okay.
Would say that is the prime motivation behind the sheriffs and Republicans' outrage. There are a number of Republican lawmakers, both the House and Senate, said that it's terribly dangerous to have killers out among us. But the fact is, unless you get a life sentence or unless you die in prison, you are going to get out someday. And the point they were making, the point they wanted to make is come on, let's continue and kick them out of the country.
Yeah.
Well,
Peter.
this has come up all over the country, though, in years, and Illinois is not the only state with this kind of a policy. The policy here in Illinois is that if you have a judicial warrant for somebody, we'll hold them. But these ICE detainers, as they call them,
And ICE is
Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Right.
They're not really judicial warrants. And sometimes it's very expensive for county sheriffs to hold people in jail for ICE, who often never shows up to come pick them up. And so I think a lot of states and municipalities around the country have said, we're just not going to do this on a detainer. If you really want the person, go to a judge and get a warrant.
Okay. Well, I think the Pritzker administration did say they were following the law as they understand it, but they were also reviewing it after these Republicans and some sheriffs showed up at the State House and raised what they consider as serious concerns. So we'll see where that, if it goes on as is, or if anything else happens. So let's talk about coronavirus a bit. Obviously the stock market took some bad tumbles in the last several days over concern about this, and state of Illinois, like every other governmental unit, is saying that they're ready. Dave McSweeney is a state representative from Barrington Hills, who called for the governor to appoint like a czar, but the governor said we have good directors of our agencies, the health agency and the emergency services agency. So we are taking all appropriate preparations. I don't know what else can be expected of a state other than we'll see what the national mood is about this, because clearly all kinds of high-level officials, federal and state, will be called to action if things go bad.
Well, I think right now, there is some danger of the virus spreading. We don't know that much about how this virus behaves because it is a novel coronavirus. But the impact it's having on the global economy, I think, is something. It's disrupting supply chains because you have manufacturing cities in China that are virtually under quarantine. You have schools that are being closed. You have factories that are being shuttered for the time being until they can get this thing under control. And as you said at the beginning, it's sending the stock market into a nosedive this week, which can have an impact on state government because people pay income taxes on capital gains. You make money in the stock market, you pay taxes on the profits that you make, and now people are taking big capital losses, and that can have a big impact on revenue streams.
Yeah, so we'll see what happens. Certainly local health officials are all keeping an eye on this as well, but we'll see, obviously bigger cities. There's so much traveling going on around that it is something that
Yeah, it does kind of remind you that we really are in a global economy, in a global society now. It's spreading to the Middle East and to East Asia and even into Italy now because people travel all over the world. And there's a lot of contact and a lot of places where a virus can jump on a bus and move across town, move across the world.
Well, we all hope for the best. Dave,
Sure.
Planned Parenthood and other groups came to the State House this last week seeking legislation to mandate age-appropriate sex education, kindergarten through 12th grade. I believe you covered that story.
I did go.
And I'm just wondering, there's obviously this kind of thought gets emotional, but age appropriate really means what? When you're talking about a kindergartner, you're talking about like who's a safe adult to talk to, that kind of a thing, right?
Probably. We didn't really examine the kindergarten angle that closely, but it was Planned Parenthood and Equality Illinois, and they're describing this as an up-to-date physical health and safety curriculum with some sexual education components. And by the way, which they didn't come right out and say at the top of it, an LGBTQ component. They had a young man from Marion who was queer. And this individual said that the correct pronouns were they, them, and their. Mm-hmm. So his name was Trey. I should say their name was Trey. In any event, they're involved in a LGBTQ organization in Carbondale called the Rainbow Cafe. And Trey said that that's great, but having an anti-bullying atmosphere at school, having something where LGBTQ people can be themselves and not fear for being bullied or being discriminated against is great. And a lot of people don't like that. They would see it as the government saying in school that it's okay to be gay. And there are a lot of people out there who would say, number one, it's not okay to be gay, and number two, my tax dollars should not go to the government school teaching that being gay is okay.
Interesting. It's an overwhelmingly Democratic legislature, but this is not always a Democratic-Republican issue necessarily. There is also an opt-out for parents to say, you know, you can take your kids out of this kind of instruction. There's also concerns from school administrators that this is another thing that you're telling schools to do without providing the funding, and it's a difficult thing to train, you know, everybody, because it takes time and effort, and it takes away from other things.
And it is a legitimate question about, you know, to what extent does the Illinois State Legislature need to be involved in defining school curriculum? We have teachers, we have principals, we have boards of education, locally elected boards who are in charge of doing that. So it's a legitimate question, and it always comes up when the state, you know, last year I think they were mandating that certain history textbooks have to have some component where it focuses on the contributions of the LGBT community.
Especially if you're mentioning people like Jane Addams in Chicago, to say that this is part of who she was.
Yeah. So, you know, I think schools have a legitimate concern there, but at the same time, I think, you know, society is changing. Attitudes around homosexuality and different kinds of sexual orientation are changing.
Well, with marriage becoming legal by
one of the most rapid
Court,
societal changes I've ever seen in my lifetime.
Agreed.
Usually these things happen at a snail's pace over generations, and this, you know, has just it just hit a critical mass, I think, within the last 10 to 20 years.
But the question, will the legislature move on this year with everything else going on?
Well, it's an election year. You know, how much turmoil do you want to stir up?
Which may mean people like Speaker Madigan may decide this is not the year for the vote. Although, I mean, he has allowed controversial things to go through in various years, but I'm just not sure this is the year for that. We'll see. And again, I wasn't at the event. Another big issue always on the agenda, because the legislature has to every year come up with a budget, and it, of course, starts with the governor proposing his budget and then legislators proposing theirs. But Peter, you, I believe, were at a hearing where some university presidents were saying that the 5% that the Governor Pritzker wants to give universities as an increase, if the graduated income tax passes in November as a constitutional amendment, and so more money will come in starting next January. But some universities want even more than that for various reasons.
You know, the process actually began probably last fall, when state agencies, including universities, have to submit a budget request to the governor's office. The governor's office sifts through that and decides, I'll give you this, I'm not going to give you that, whatever. But the governor came out and said, you know, it's an average 5% increase in the operating budgets for each of the universities. Also increases in the MAP grants and
which is for low-income students to get
financial aid for lower-income students, as well as a new financial aid thing called Aim High. There's money for that. But yeah, I guess most of the universities really got hit hard during the 2-year budget impasse.
Right, when Governor Rauner couldn't get along with the Democratic legislature and didn't sign budgets except for K through 12 some years, or at least one full year.
And so, you know, there was no authority to send money to the universities. They have other revenue streams, tuition, federal grants, things like that, and endowments. But the universities really got hit hard, probably harder than any other segment of state government. And so they're coming in, I think the U of I system was asking for something like a 12% increase.
I read your story saying that,
I think Eastern Illinois was looking at maybe 10%. And then Governor's State University, which has actually had some bad PR problems here lately, they were asking for about a 6% between 6 and 7% increase. Yeah.
Yeah, and this was at an appropriations or
Senate appropriations.
Any reaction from
And-
legislators? Does it look like they are open to the idea that maybe more than what the governor wants might go to any of these institutions?
Well, and see, there's this catch to the governor's proposal,
Right.
is that you only get it if voters approve the income tax amendment in November, which will start generating additional revenue next January, if they do. If they don't, then you're going to have flat budgets, basically the same as the current year. And they're saying that would actually be very harmful for them because they now are facing higher minimum wage costs.
Which were passed last
yeah.
year, and they're moving up by 2025 to $15 an hour.
Yeah, and they're going to keep going up. They have to give, they have employees, faculty, staff who haven't had pay raises in a long time. And so a flat budget is really not on the cards.
Right.
But then, you have legislators saying, well, how much of this is going for rehiring administrators as opposed to providing more services in the classroom or focusing on students? So, and that issue always comes up because higher education is seen as very top-heavy with administration.
Right. And as we know, Dave, the school districts in general, the governor's budget proposal is controversial in the sense that he said if we pass the graduated income tax, they'll get their full K through 12 education will get their full $350 million a year, and if not, it's only going to be $200. And even some Democrats don't like that.
Well, that $350 is the law, and they worked to pass the evidence-based funding, the new school funding formula, and now that it's starting to bake in, the governor's talking about bailing out of it, and what's more, the school districts don't have the information on how much money they're getting from the state in a timely fashion anyway. And now we're going to wait to almost halfway through the next school year to know how much they're going to get. So there's plenty not to like about it, and it's almost like the governor is daring us to do something or not do something.
And a lot of Republicans are casting this as kind of holding the state hostage, I think is one of the words they use.
Well, it seemed to be, somebody must have said it in a caucus because several people said it all at once right after the governor's budget address.
Yeah.
And the governor said, well, it's terrible to compare me to Governor Rauner, who held so many things, social service agencies, hostage to the budget impasse. But he also says if this tax doesn't pass, we'll be at this level. And he's just saying he's being realistic. So
he is. If they don't approve this, then we've got X amount of money, and that only goes so far. And his proposal is to spend it that way, which is pretty much a flat budget.
$1.4 billion is the list of
potential
things
spending that would not be spent without the graduate income tax.
Out of a $40 billion budget, or 42.
Yeah, it's 42 if we vote for the graduated income tax, but out of a $40 billion budget, we're talking about $350 million. That's...
Well, remember Everett Dirksen, a million here, a million there.
At
some point, you're talking real money.
40 billion with a B, 350 million.
Understood.
A relative sliver.
Except the schools really want it. So, let's talk even a smaller sliver, and that is the word came in that in the first full month, January, of legal marijuana sales in Illinois, legal for recreational purposes, brought in $10 million in taxes to the state, $7.3 million in tax, which is special to marijuana, and the cannabis tax, and $3.1 million in regular sales tax. So it's not going to solve the state's problems, but it is interesting that the culture has continued to change in the state, and people I think are still lining up at these places. I don't know if it's as crazy beyond the opening days in January.
So you haven't been in a while?
No, not yet.
It's kind of hard to tell whether that actually represents the demand for marijuana out there. That's how big the market is, or there are a lot of people going out and buying it just for the novelty of it. These are just first month's sales figures. So we'll see whether or not that can sustain itself. The other thing is during the first month, they've had a lot of supply issues.
Right, they had to close, a lot of them were closed Mondays to recreational sales because they didn't have enough, and they have to have enough for medicinal purposes, which has been legal for a few years in the state. And
they just got the grower's license to start producing specifically for recreational marijuana. And they don't grow instantly. They're plants. It takes a few months to get a crop up and going. So So there could be more supply by the time the spring arrives. We'll just have to see whether or not the demand holds up.
Have you seen a change in the black market, Bernie?
You act as if I should know, but I don't.
I presume that those dealers are still out there, that if you don't want to wait in line, there might be a way to get it.
Yeah, and I know that there was often thoughts of that kind of problem, and I know the whole law is designed to bring business to more people, particularly in underserved areas, so we'll see what happens with that. Just another, there are so many bills that get introduced, and a lot of them go nowhere, but I don't know where this one goes. Senator Melinda Bush and Representative Ann Williams have legislation to charge 10 cents per plastic bag, and also don't have restaurants not give you plastic utensils unless you ask. This is the kind of thing that is environmentally positive to many, but is the kind of thing that, again, in an election year, a lot of people might just want to avoid voting for. I don't know.
Certainly makes for an easy attack ad.
You mean against them? They want to
Right.
take your fork?
Right.
It's probably more of an issue, the issue of single-use plastics, plastic straws, plastic silverware. These things end up in Lake Michigan. They end up in oceans. I've heard people say that, that study shorebirds.
Yeah.
They've never found, the carcass of a shorebird that didn't have plastic in it. Because it's getting to be a huge problem.
And it depends kind of where the world turns and if Illinois is on that progressive edge, and we'll see how it goes this year in an election year. With that, Dave Dahl and Peter Hancock, thanks for your discussion. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.